it was interesting to keep it like light in the sense of having a kind of nice conversation. So, as Yvonne said, I'm working at UNDP Bangkok Regional Hub on precisely on a project on promoting a fair business environment in ASEAN. And here with me today, I have also another colleague, Mr. Brook Horowitz, who is a business integrity advisor in the same team. And he also, in 2014, co-founded the IBLF Global. It is International Business Leader Forum. It's an NGO that promotes responsible business through collective action. And after that, he also led several projects on anti-corruption in a variety of countries, including Russia, Turkey, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. For example, he was also involved in setting up a government business integrity initiative in Vietnam. And he also played a variety of leadership role in the B20, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative of the companies and governments of the G20 group. And this is what he has in common with our other speaker, Mr. Christopher Costa. Thank you, Christopher, also for your presence at such an early time for you. Christopher is based in the US. He spent more than 14 years with EY Forensic Practice, where he served as a Global Chief Operating Officer. Chris has been involved in anti-corruption public policies for many years. He presented at the OECD Working Group on Bribery, and he also serves as a knowledge partner to the B20 Anti-Corruption Working Group. He did this under the Turkish, Chinese, and Saudi Arabian presidency, where he is just an adjunct member of a Mayer Brown law firm. So with them, today, we're going to have this conversation on global anti-corruption policy and private sector engagement. Why? Well, we are talking about corruption now, and corruption, it's a main problem, a main obstacle for doing business, as you all know very well, that you are here. And actually, in this period, in this very strange period of our lifetime, we are going through a pandemic. So all the countries and all the people have been touched by this, affected by this, let's say, tragedy. And we know that the pandemic makes also the ground fertile for further corruption. Corruption can further flourish. There is uncertainty, there is disruption, there are all these emergency procedures, so corrupt actors can also take advantage of this situation for their private gain. And we know that corruption can also undermine not only the current response to the emergency, but really also undermine the recovery efforts afterwards. It can exacerbate the socioeconomic impact of COVID, and it certainly is pointing out at the social injustices and at the inequalities that many people are suffering. But at the same time, this is also a time that can be an opportunity of change, of transformative change, and altogether both private sector and public sector can join hands instead to build back better together. What we're gonna do in this session today is we will start our conversation talking about the global policy existing on anti-corruption and what can be their impact on the business that you are conducting on every day. We will talk then on the national legislation and judicial reforms. Then we will move on talking about policies and tools for implementation. And finally, some final thoughts and some space for Q&A. So we will all try to stick to our time and then leave some time for discussion. I would like, therefore, to start with Brook. I would like, Brook, you to, can you please provide us an overview of the major initiatives in the multilateral institution that address corruption at the global level, maybe starting with the UNCAP?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Liviana, and hello, everybody. Thank you for having us on this very interesting conference. The UN Convention Against Corruption, or UNCAC, is the fundamental piece of international legislation that governs the international community's work around corruption. Now, if you're working in a company in a country, you may not be particularly aware of UNCAC because it's international law. It doesn't affect you directly, but it does affect you indirectly because once it has been ratified, the national government has got to, where you're operating, has got to put it into national law. And UNCAC actually came into being in 2003, but you can see that the ratifications didn't happen immediately. And in fact, some countries, even Germany, only ratified, I think it was in 2013 or 14. Now, nearly all the countries of the world have ratified it, except for a few offshore havens, unsurprisingly, and I think Syria. But on the whole, UNCAC has been a very influential piece of legislation, and the more countries that have acceded to it and then implemented that legislation in their national laws, the more influence it has. There's another piece of very important legislation, which is the OECD's Anti-Bribery Convention. Now, the OECD is really limited to the developed countries, but which is, I think, 26 members of OECD, but there are actually 37 signatories to the Anti-Bribery Convention. So here too, there's a very rigorous approach to the countries. It's quite influential. They do review processes every year, and the countries that get reviewed are often put under serious international pressure to reform their anti-corruption laws. So what we've seen over the last years, and we'll come back to the national level legislation in a few minutes, but we've seen a lot of reform of anti-corruption legislation in the part of the world where we are, that's to say in Southeast Asia, in the developed countries in Europe, in the United States. There's other pressures, of course, not just the fact that legislation is changing. The impact of the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers scandals have really pushed this agenda forward. And what we're seeing, in fact, is a convergence of various aspects of criminal behavior which could broadly be associated with corruption. So it's anti-money laundering, it's human rights abuses, that's to say, not necessarily civil rights, but certainly social and economic rights. It's the business and human rights movement, which has been going on for several years, but was pretty weak in the last decade, but has now become come into its own. There's more and more legislation and implementation and enforcement of anti-modern slavery legislation, and then that gets all linked in with the anti-terrorism, asset recovery, sanctions regimes. All these things come together. I know that you've been hearing about some of these earlier today. The UN is putting more and more emphasis on this as a unified organization, and next year in June there will be a special session of the UN General Assembly focused on anti-corruption. And I think that is an event to watch because while it may not change anything in the short term, these kind of big ticket events do tend to have a longer term influence. So that, in a nutshell, is what's going on at a global multilateral level. Chris perhaps can tell us a bit more about some specific examples.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you very much to the organizers for having us. And we all wish we were in Beijing, in person. I was there last August. It seems like a different world ago, but wonderful to be with Liviana and Brook. As Liviana mentioned, Brook and I have a common experience of being involved in the B20 process. This year, the Saudis are the president of the G20 member states, and they are working hard with other countries around the world on anti-corruption public policy. And it's been my pleasure to serve as one of the knowledge partners to the B20 Integrity and Compliance Task Force this year. So a few quick highlights on what's happening at the G20. As some of you may know, the G20 has the Anti-Corruption Working Group, which is a governmental gathering. They work on 3-year anti-corruption action plans. The current one is for 2019 to 2021. And that's worth having a look on the internet for and having a quick browse. The Saudis are leading an effort to develop 2 new sets of G20 high-level principles. As you may know, there's been a series of these high-level principles over the years on everything from integrity and SOEs to beneficial ownership and a range of other topics. But the 2 new ones for this fall will be one on the development of national anti-corruption strategies and the other on information and communications technologies. So look for those probably in mid-October. There's a B20 summit in Riyadh, or perhaps actually it's going to be virtual. So that'll be, I think, around the 3rd week of October. And there'll be, for the first time ever, a anti-corruption ministerial immediately after the B20 summit. So again, that's a significant, as Brook mentioned, big ticket event that's coming up. So the work of the B20 this year is a joint effort of executives from 100 companies from the G20 member states. And, we're really working on a handful of topics, and we're closely aligned with the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group. So our policy paper, which will be out later this summer, deals with national anti-corruption strategies as well. It deals with whistleblower protections and emerging trends in technology around whistleblower communications. Deals with gender and anti-corruption, which is obviously a very important topic. And we also deal with digital identity and beneficial ownership data quality, national public registers of beneficial ownership data, and then lastly, public procurement. These are all topics that are critically important, not just to government, but to business. And that's the whole point of the B20, is to get business to give input into G20 public policy. So for your organizations, if you haven't historically been involved in the B20 Integrity and Compliance Task Force work, I mean, this is a bit of a request, a call to action for you to see if your organization wants to get involved. We're always welcome new voices, in the process. So next year, the G20 president will be Italy. So I'm sure everybody will love some visits to Rome. So what a wonderful thing to get involved in next year and to help us with anti-corruption public policy in 2021. So Liviana, that's just a quick run through some of what's happening at the G20 and B20 level. How would you like to proceed?
Thank you very much, Chris. It was very good also to learn about the mechanism of the B20 and how companies could get engaged if they are interested. I think I would still like to ask you one more question, moving now to the second topic on my list. It is talking about national legislative and judicial reform. So we know that this is also an exciting time in terms of legislative changes. Would you tell us more, Chris, about the last developments on anti-corruption legislation in the US, and especially those that have an impact that goes well beyond the US territory?
Sure, no, my pleasure. I guess a few things. Number one, very conscious that all of you practice in this area and you're well familiar with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and you've had some excellent presentations earlier today. I have to confess I was asleep, given it's just past 4:15 in the morning here in New York. But I did look through the slides. So Harry Liu from King & Wood Mallesons and Dr. Loy dealt with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act at a high level, so I won't go through that again. But what I will call your attention to are two very, very important developments just in the last 6 weeks. The first is the publication last Friday of the new Department of Justice and Securities and Exchange Commission FCPA Resource Guide. This is 130 pages of very practical guidance from the US government. It was first published in 2012, and this is the second time that they've put forward the resource guide. It's tremendously important. Everybody should have a very careful read of the document. And the second piece was in June, which was the evaluation of corporate compliance programs. This is a document that's gone through a few iterations. And so you're going to get a very comprehensive discussion of these documents tomorrow from Nat Edmonds of the Paul Hastings law firm. I've known Nat for a long time. He's a great lawyer, former Department of Justice prosecutor. So he'll get into a lot of the details, but I'll just give you a few quick, very quick highlights. On the resource guide, what you're going to find is a lot of additional information on interpretations of statutory language, from definitions of foreign official, instrumentality, agent. These are all terms that have been subject to judicial review and rulings from courts at various levels in the United States since 2012. So the Department of Justice and SEC have defined these, again, put new interpretations of the statutory language forward in the document. Also, the document includes some updated examples of prior enforcement actions, including a number of hypotheticals that are useful, very instructive, including about third-party vetting. And it does also incorporate all of the program evaluation points that were brought up in the document revised in June. That document, just a few brief observations on that one. The Department of Justice has really added emphasis on the importance of risk assessments, because these risk assessments are what drive the design of your compliance program. And most importantly, they're focused on how those programs have evolved over time. They're not really interested in the static, well, they are interested in everything, but they're interested in how the program has evolved over time, how you continue to do risk assessments and how those risk assessments have changed the program that you have in place. They also have a lot of comments on the importance of resourcing of your compliance program. And given COVID-19 and all the financial pressures on companies, I'm sure there are going to be a lot of difficult discussions around compliance department budgets. And those of you that are having those discussions, I mean, this is a good document to have at hand when you're battling with the CFOs on your next year plans, because the department is definitely looking at whether your program is appropriately resourced, and they want to know that you are allocating your resources, your efforts in a risk-tailored fashion. So more on that later when Brook and I talk about third-party risk management. But lastly, just to say that there's an emphasis as well on periodic reviews of the program and applying lessons learned from your compliance activities into changes from changes in the program. And I think what's really interesting here is they explicitly say that the department expects you to learn from your peer companies and other companies' experience in the markets where you're operating. So it's not just about lessons learned from your own company's activities, but what is happening in the market. So I think that's really an interesting point, and you'll find it on page 16 of the document around evolving updates. So that is a very quick run through what's going on with the FCPA, with DOJ and SEC, and again, more from Nat Edmonds tomorrow on that. But I just want to take a minute to just highlight a number of new pieces of legislation that are working their way through Congress. Obviously, I think everybody is aware that this is an election year, and there's not a lot of bipartisanship in Washington these days. But there are 4 pieces of legislation that are worth taking a look at. Two deal with the demand side of corruption, and two are really dealing with the beneficial ownership issue. The two on the demand side are the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act. And, you know, as some of you may know, in Congress, they love to produce really long names for legislation that have clever acronyms. So the other one is called the Crook Act, which is the Countering Russia and Other Overseas Kleptocracy Act. And those I would commend to you, both led by Democrats. So one in the House, one in the, actually both in the House of Representatives. So it'll be interesting to see what happens if they make any progress this fall on those, and whether they're picked up after the elections in November. The other two I mentioned on beneficial ownership, that's the Illicit Cash Act, and that is a crazy long acronym, improving laundering laws and increasing compliance information tracking of criminal activity in shell holdings, illicit cash. And the other one is the Corporate Transparency Act. And the Corporate Transparency Act has actually made the most progress, having passed the House of Representatives and now is in the Senate. I won't go into details on those, but you can find a great deal of information on congress.gov to go through those. So that's a very quick canter through, Liviana.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. And so congress.gov, I think you mentioned as a good source of information to get more details about this. And if we move from the US to the UK, Brook, can you tell us something more instead about the UK Bribery Act, which has also been quite influential in setting some high new standards, both in the UK and abroad? I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you. Well, the UK Bribery Act came in 2011, and there was a 5-year review last year, which I had a chance to participate in in the House of Lords. And in some ways, it's been a great success. In other ways, perhaps not. The slightly dubious part of this is that there haven't really been that many prosecutions or convictions. And there have been quite a few cases that have been taken up by the Serious Fraud Office, which is the anti-corruption agency that is mostly responsible for the big prosecutions, and they've had to abandon some of them. So that hasn't been the most successful side of it. But on the other hand, the Bribery Act was a very clear piece of legislation. It generated some very nice guidance, and it was also part of a national anti-corruption strategy for the UK. And I think that that has set something of a high bar for other countries to emulate. And I think Dr. Loy has already spoken about the Malaysian recent Corporate Liability Act that came into force in Malaysia in June. And yeah, some of the major ideas around adequate procedures, the failure to prevent bribery, the nature of the criminal liability, those kind of things have seen their ways into other countries' anti-corruption legislation. There's a whole lot more going on in the UK around the UK Bribery Act, and I talked about the convergence of anti-corruption and other similar related legislations. So we've got civil recovery orders, we've got unexplained wealth orders, again those are being pursued in the courts. There's the Magnitsky Act, which has been in place in the United States. Just a couple of days ago, the UK announced the first list of sanctioned individuals, mostly from Russia and Saudi Arabia. There's the Modern Slavery Act, and then there's quite a lot of soft activity. I personally have been involved for the last couple of years with a program initiated by the Department for International Development, which is now being merged with the UK Foreign Office, but it's called the UK Business Integrity Initiative. And the idea there is to help British companies that are exporting or investing abroad and who now are challenged with having to find new markets outside of the European Union, thanks to Brexit. Many of the markets that the UK will have to go into and be successful in are quite high risk as far as corruption is concerned. So the British government's providing grants and support for British companies to learn more about the sort of things that we're talking about in this conference. It's just a very clear example of how governments are now becoming increasingly active in not only putting forward new legislation, but also enforcing it and then providing the kind of soft power accompaniment which will actually make it happen in practice. Now, if I look briefly at our situation in Southeast Asia, you can see a similar pattern, maybe not quite done as methodically as the UK, but there are some very interesting examples of legislation that's just come out in the last couple of years in Myanmar, Malaysia, as I mentioned before, in Indonesia. There's some new legislation in China. And then in Vietnam, last year's revised law on anti-corruption. And here, again, it is very interesting to look at Vietnam, which clearly has got a problem with corruption, but is now, at least on the legal side and the legislative side, trying to do something about it by putting forward this new legislation, in which is a clause specifically directed at the private sector. And that's not all, because the kind of program that we've been doing with UNDP and the Vietnam government and the Vietnam Chamber of Commerce is specifically focused on helping companies understand that law and to bring it into their management systems in a practical and not overburdensome way. And I think that this is the clue about the future direction of anti-corruption initiatives. You've got to have the law, you've got to have some kind of enforcement, but if the business community is so unfamiliar with this kind of legislation or with the consequences of getting things wrong, then you have to educate the business community. And I think the Vietnam example is a very good one of how that's happening. The United States example that Chris was just talking about as well. I mean, you know, it is extraordinary that considering this FCPA legislation first came into force in 1975, they are still updating the guidance for companies. So clearly there is an issue here of the theory of the legislation and the practice on the ground. And governments and NGOs and organizations like UNDP and B20 are very anxious to bridge that gap. So I think rather than talk any more about that, there's plenty to talk about on national level legislation, but let me hand back over to Liviana.
Thank you, Brook. Thank you very much. And also, the fact that you mentioned, for example, what our project did in Vietnam connects me well also to the following question, because basically now we have talked about the legislation and let's say at the top level, but we need also to reflect on which tools are available and how then we enforce and implement the laws. And indeed, projects such as the Fair Business Environment project that UNDP is leading with the support of the UK government is really trying to do this, to build a fair business environment, which means to look also at the very different actors that are in place. So it's not something that the job is not done just working at the legislation with the government. First of all, also when we provide support to governments in developing or updating their legislation, we also promote like a multi-stakeholders process, a consultation process. So we engage also stakeholders to go and have a say and to help in developing these laws and regulations. And then what we do is really trying to engage all the various actors, including, for example, the companies, empowering them, providing the skills, raising awareness about the new regulations that are in place, and giving them the skills to really go along this path and comply and actually lead with the integrity and with compliance. So this is something that we try to do with the project, for example. So now discussing again some more examples of practical implementation, and discussing also how these laws have an impact on the everyday operation of business. We can talk about two important themes in my view. One is the third-party risk management, and another one is the whistleblower protection and mechanism. So let's start with the third-party risk management. And maybe Brook, would you like to start, and then Chris can complement with other examples from his side.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. So I think that the challenge for compliance, I mean, traditionally it's been, how do you inculcate within the four walls of your own company a compliant culture? How do you explain to people from different cultures about how they are supposed to behave, what their expectations are within the company? And it seems to me that in some ways companies can control that very well. They can do what they want within their four walls. They can provide the training, they can provide surveillance, they've got internal audit that's checking up on lots of financial operations, and with the new technologies, that is becoming very widespread. So in some ways that battle for, and I'm now talking about global multinationals that are seriously keeping awake at night because of the implications of getting it wrong under US or UK or other legislation where that law is being enforced. But I think that battle, in a way, has been won, or is being won. And the remaining challenge is, how do you deal with third parties? Because they are independent companies. They are located in legislations where there may not be the pressure of enforcement. So what the company, the global multinational, is essentially is a proxy for the US, the long arm of the US law. The US company or the UK company or European company really must take responsibility for how the third parties are behaving within their supply chain. And if they fail to, then the mother company can be prosecuted. We know about this. But what is the solution? How do you get these messages across to your third party? Traditionally, the way to do it is to have an anti-corruption clause in your distributor contract or in your joint venture partnership agreement. But in my view, that's not enough. And my evidence that it's not enough is that out of, over the last few years, 89% of FCPA cases have related to third parties. And they've been caused by third parties going off in a different direction. So control is definitely one thing. I think the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, guidance that Chris was mentioning, that's come out of the United States in Department of Justice just last month, is very interesting, because they are saying that you don't need to look at all the companies equally. You've got to do a risk assessment and then go into a huge amount of detail on the companies that are high risk, and others you can manage as you go along. So I think that they're being very clear about installing management systems that are proportionate to what you need to manage your risk. The second point that is in there, and again, I think it offers a very, very clear direction for the future, which is about the form, content, and effectiveness of training. So in that document, the authors ask, has the training been offered in the form and language appropriate for the audience? Is the training provided online or in person or both? What is the company's rationale for its choice? Has the training addressed lessons learned from prior compliance incidents? Is there a process by which employees can ask questions? How has the company measured the effectiveness of the training? So all these questions are really good, because actually, if you can't answer them, then you have a less than appropriate program. And in fact, your procedures are probably not adequate, especially after the Department of Justice has issued these kind of guidance questions. My feeling about this, and please argue with me when we have the chance later, is that I don't believe that the sort of single global compliance program, English language based on US or UK thinking, translated into the local language, signed off by employees, I don't think that does the trick. I don't think it gets close to explaining to somebody who's been brought up in China or Russia or South Africa or anywhere else about the fundamental reasons why this is important. I actually think that there's a big work of not just translation, but adaptation of the message, not the substance, but how you get the message across to employees from very different cultures. And I think that's the sort of thing that with our UNDP program, we're trying to explore.
And I think, Brook,
Chris,
if I could just add, just very briefly, I think there is some cause for optimism from the corporate perspective around, how the work of knowing your third parties is done. And I think the good news, the optimistic news, is that there's a lot of progress around the establishment of public national registers of beneficial ownership data. And establishing these national registers and then making them available to the public and therefore to corporates is going to speed the process of really getting behind the ownership of your third parties. There are 81 countries now around the world that have the enabling legislation for the creation of national registers. There's some big glaring holes, though, of course, in that the United States has no national register, China has no national register, so on and so forth, but the pressure is building. So I would commend to you the research of the Tax Justice Network on this topic. But I guess in the interest of time, shall we move on to the whistleblower topic?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just very briefly, as all of you know, the European Union last year, new directive on whistleblower protections. It's a very significant piece of legislation, though the process of transposing that directive into national law is rather behind schedule. I mean, understandable given COVID. The U.S. SEC Office of the Whistleblower, for those of you that are SEC registrants, I'm sure you're aware of this program. They've given more than, almost $400 million since the program's creation to 67 individuals. This is a program that's seen about a 30% plus increase in tips since COVID-19 hit. And I would just point out to you, looking at the data from the last 3 years, about 25% of all of the tips that have come in from outside the United States, that's about 400 tips in the last 3 years, have come from Asian countries. So just know that there's a real priority in responding quickly to the whistleblowers, lest they go directly to the SEC. The good news on that is that there's some emerging technologies that make that trusted communication with your employees, whether it's about improper conduct or whether it's about concerns about COVID-19, much easier and much more mobile friendly as well. I'll just highlight one technology company in particular that's got Australian roots, which is Wisply, WHISPLI, that has a very low cost, very effective platform and tremendous case management capabilities, which I think will give you the analytics that you need to know that your whistleblower hotline program is doing well, it's effective. Shall we?
Well, I just wanted to come in very briefly on whistleblowing, and then we should begin to wrap up, so there's a bit of time for people to make comments. But I think that this whistleblowing, in a way, it's the same kind of phenomenon as the third party. I mean, whistleblowing may work in the United States where hopefully there is whistleblower protection, although you can look at the big political topic of the day, which was the whistleblowing about President Trump's dialogues with the Ukrainian president. It doesn't always work. The fellow just lost his job or has decided not to pursue his
retired.
Career. Retired, whatever. And I think that, in countries where the civil society, business and government do not have a high level of trust, or where even in a company, the employees do not particularly trust their leaders and the CEOs and the board, whistleblowing is almost useless. Apart from that, there are huge sort of historical antecedents that make whistleblowing, it gives it quite a bad name in some societies. So again, I think that when companies are looking at whistleblowing systems, either within their four walls or within their supply chains, it's very important. It's the way of getting information. It's far better than, the advanced forensic data and all of that stuff. It's the whistleblowing that makes the difference. But, you've got to set it up in the right way. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done both on an academic side and a practical side. Let me hand over to Liviana to help us to wrap up our conversation.
Yes. Thank you very much for this conversation. It was very interesting. I would like also to remind our attendees that in case they would like to intervene to ask some questions, they can use the chat box or they can raise their hand. But now let's have some final words. So you have done, I think, both of you, a great job in kind of summarizing and providing an overview of the global policies on anti-corruption, the legislation, and bringing also some concrete examples on how this can affect the daily operations. Now, I would like to ask you to choose a couple of challenges and opportunities to discuss with us. Challenges and opportunities that you can find both at the maybe government level and at the corporate level. I would like you to start with the challenges so that we end on a positive note, finding also the good opportunities. Maybe we can start with Chris.
Yeah, sure. I think first on the governmental side, just to say that, what's one of the big priorities for multinationals when they have these kind of, enforcement issues is getting a global resolution, among the various country authorities that are involved. And unfortunately, I think what we're going to see is more and more cross-border tension, in the aftermath of COVID-19 that may make those global resolutions more difficult to get to. Brook, did you have a government-oriented?
Well, yeah, I think clearly COVID-19 is the big challenge, and in some ways, in the same way that COVID has spurred us to become much more used to working from home and using Zoom and not going into the office. I think there's going to be a bit of a revolution on the anti-corruption side as well, because on one hand, it is a distraction, COVID. On the other hand, it is going to create a more governmentally funded economy, which is going to be open to corruption abuse. And as soon as the governments get to understand it, I think the anti-corruption movement, which has been somewhat sidetracked in the last couple of years, is going to come back with a vengeance. The other governmental sort of challenge that I would see, which is more for the governments, but it's also for the companies, is the issue of civil rights. So with more surveillance technologies, with more intervening by governments, there will be this pressure on civil rights, and there's going to be pushback. There's no doubt about that. Well, certainly in some countries, but let's just remember that some of the big regime changes that have taken place over the last 10 years were driven by populations that were dissatisfied with their governments abusing their rights and being corrupt. So I think the pushback that governments will see from going too quickly on corruption is a big risk.
Yeah, and a related point, I think, for me on the corporate side is that corporate compliance efforts benefit from being able to analyze large data sets. I mean, huge data sets from operations across all the countries where your company is present. But there's a tension between gathering that data and data privacy. And I think that's really a big challenge. And that's what really leads to a need for what's called federated learning, where the data stays where it is, but the algorithms move to the data. And I would commend to you an excellent new paper from the Royal United Services Institute in London on privacy preserving analytics, which is really interesting. So shall we go to the positives? Go to the opportunities?
Sorry, just on the corporate side, though, just one final point about that. I think the advance of technology, the use of AI, blockchain in compliance functions is going to fundamentally change the compliance function. And I think some of those issues that we've just mentioned, Chris and myself, around civil rights, about privacy, these things are going to be pretty central to how a company operates with its own employees, with its supply chains, and with its markets. And it does seem to me that the compliance officer is going to be much less to do with compliance and much more to do with ethics. So I think we'll be seeing a lot of chief ethics officers coming out of the kind of community that we're talking to today. Yeah, opportunities, Chris.
Yeah, on the government side, just to say quickly, digital identities, for legal entities and natural persons, there's again a lot of momentum around progress in that area, which is very important, for the beneficial ownership data registers. And then maybe just on the corporate side, the good news about all this financial pressure on companies now is it does spur creativity and openness to embrace emerging technologies. With APIs, there's so much you can do to have analytics delivered software as a service. So there's a lot of innovation happening that will make your roles more effective and hopefully more efficient.
Yeah, I see the big opportunity in collective action. I mean, I just don't think the governments are equipped or able to do this by themselves. In many of the markets which we work in, civil society is relatively weak. I think that's going to be changing, but nevertheless, business is the driver here. Business can say we're going to invest or we're going to divest, and business employs thousands, tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Each company has got a huge amount of influence to change the moral and ethical environment which is in there. So I think that companies will be not only quasi-regulators, but these educators of the future workforce of the world to behave in a clean and ethical way.
Thank you. Thank you, Brook. I see actually now that we have also a question from the audience. So I would like to give the opportunity to the participant to speak. So let's see if we...
Yeah, I think this question is for Brook and Chris. I mean, I think, first of all, thank you so much. It was really very useful and very informative. Can you all hear me?
And can you introduce yourself?
Yes, introduce yourself, please.
Yes, hi, my name is Arun Doraiswamy. I sit in Singapore. I'm the head of compliance for Asia Pacific for my company.
So your company is Siemens? Siemens
Gamesa.
Yeah.
We are a company wholly owned by Siemens. It's a joint venture between Siemens AG and Gamesa, which is a Spanish wind turbine company.
Great.
Got it.
Go ahead.
Yes, please. Thank you so much. It was really informative and quite useful. I mean, there was one particular comment of Brook, which is, I think, very valid. It said, if it can't be some forensics or whatever, how can whistleblowing process be more practical in approach? I think I would see if you can elaborate on that, Brook, because maybe could creating a trustworthy environment in an organization be the answer, or do you have some other ideas?
Well, I think that's got to be the starting point, Aaron. I mean, without that, it's not going to work at all. But I remember having this conversation when I was doing some of this work in Russia quite a few years ago, in the days when you could talk about these things and expect results in Russia. And I remember one of the big Russian companies was saying, well, we've set up a whistleblowing system and it's fantastic. In fact, one of the big four helped us to do it. And I said, well, where does that, the hotline, where does it go into? Does it go into your human resources or does it go into your legal department? And the guy said, no, it goes into our security department. So basically, the whole notion of whistleblowing was to take it to the internal KGB of the company, and of course, if that's the attitude, or if the CEOs and so on are on the make and clearly getting a bad reputation for corruption, then I don't see how whistleblowing could work, and especially if the whistleblowing legislation around in the market itself is weak. I mean, the whistleblower protection. So having said all of that, I think there must be some interesting ways now of using technology to deliver whistleblowers' complaints anonymously and in a way that can be tightly controlled. I don't know, Chris, you probably know more about this.
Just very, very quickly, I think the most important thing is don't narrow the topic, narrow the discussion to just whistleblowing, because really what it's about is trusted communications between your employees and the employer. And the more you get them talking to you through these platforms about a range of topics, not just about seeing inappropriate conduct, but about how they're how they're finding their work-life balance, or how they're finding, the dealing with working from home, or whatever particular pressures they're under. You just want the communication channel to be open. And I think as a rough rule of thumb, if you're talking about 4 or 5 communications per 100 employees per year, that's 4 or 5%. That's a big number. Then I think you've got a robust channel of communication open. And if it's less than that, it's probably not terribly effective.
Thank you. Thank you also.
I'm sorry, Liviana. I just want to say that, this is where I think companies can really learn from each other, because there isn't, I mean, you're asking me for a clear answer on this, and quite frankly, I don't have one. And it seems to me that the sort of platforms like, I think earlier today you heard from a couple of people who were talking, I'm sorry, I haven't got it in front of me, but about a collective action initiative coming out of Australia. And I think these kind of peer-to-peer groups where compliance officers, human resources managers get together and discuss how to manage these things, that is a very, very powerful example of collective action. And I believe that companies can help themselves and each other in those kind of platforms. You know, unfortunately, there aren't that many such groups, and I think it does require companies to take an activist role in making them happen and to organize them. Although, of course, there are quite a few facilitators like ourselves and, you know, B20 and NGOs around the world who can provide that support. Liviana, sorry.
Brook, yes, I am trying to come in because I have another couple of questions. So I would like to reply to them too. So one, I will read it for you. It's from the chat. And Andrea, but I'm not sure from which company, asked, can you kindly explain again how do you feel that the compliance officer of the future will rather be an ethical officer? And then we have a second question. Maybe we can listen also to the second one. And I will unmute Yvonne, who will present the question.
Yeah, thank you. Hope you can all hear me.
Yes.
Yes, well, actually, there was a question this morning raised by Ms. Fiona Wong, and I think you can also give some comments from your perspective. I'll also send again the question in the chat box so you can see it clear. Well, the question is about that if the company has done all the necessary things, including the due diligence, contract management, training, and even monitoring to the third party, but however, still cannot 100% prevent the third party's misconduct. What are the defenses can be made to protect the company from being punished? Is there any successful case happened before? That's the question.
Chris, would you like to take that one, and I can take the one about ethical officers?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, well, just speaking of the U.S. authorities, you know, there are numerous examples of non-prosecution agreements or declinations. So I would suggest that you look at the resource guide for some practical examples. But it is possible. I think the U.S. authorities recognize that aberrational conduct happens. So the important thing is that you've done all that you can do. You mentioned a few of those things, and that when you become aware of the conduct, how you've addressed it, you know, inside the company and then through self-reporting to the authorities. But I would commend to you the resource guide for some practical examples. Brooke?
Great, Brooke.
Well, on the, I mean, it is a little bit of a controversial point. I'm not actually saying that the compliance officers are going to be displaced and replaced by ethical officers. I'm just saying that the nature of the role may change somewhat. And the reason why the function will change is, first of all, technology, because I mean, what is compliance? Compliance is you comply with the law, you comply with the rules, but artificial intelligence and the new technologies are going to enable you to monitor all of these things, whether you are complying with the law. It's going to be automated. So of course, I'm not saying that that's what compliance officers do, but I mean, you know, that is a traditional element of the compliance officer. And I think that a lot of that can be taken on by the new technologies in time. And then the second aspect of it is that there are all these new challenges around privacy, around human rights, around civil and political rights, and not only of your employees, but the data that you hold on your clients and your customers. You've got huge responsibilities for that, and there are great big ethical issues that today are almost still unanswered because the regulation isn't even keeping up with the pace of technological development. So, what is a company to do? Who in the company is going to be responsible for that? Well, I would argue that if you don't have an ethical officer of some description who's able to deal with those big issues that are confronting the relationship of business and society, if you don't have that kind of person on board, then you're exposing yourself to big risk. It may not be corruption risk as such, but it'll certainly be reputational risk.
Thank you, Brook. Thank you, Chris, and also it's being mindful of time. I pop up this slide. I hope you are all seeing it. I just wanted to share our contact details with the attendees, because in case you have any questions, I think that now it was hard to cut the conversation because it seems that more people wanted to go on and ask more questions. So in case you want to engage with us, here you find the contacts of myself and Brook at UNDP, and also Chris.
Yeah, sorry, my email address, I should have corrected that before, but it's brook.horowitz@undp.org, not...
Yeah, exactly. And we have also our website and social media channels. But as a final message, I think that the conversation today was really engaging. And I think that maybe if we want to end on a positive note, I think that the message can be also the fact that the business really can play an active role. You can decide not to be passive and just thinking about complying, but you can just take the step further and you can act to walk the talk and to create also ethical and workplace based also on the diversity, inclusion, and trust among the people. Trust that the mechanisms that are put in place, for example, also reporting mechanism will be working well. And I think that we also shared with you a couple of ideas on how you can engage and have also your say, have also maybe your contribution for policy making, even at the global level. For example, engaging with projects such as the B20, or for example, if you are operating in ASEAN countries, then it's worthy for you to get in touch with us and learn more about what we can do maybe on the ground with the Fair Business Project. So I would conclude with this, and I would pass back the floor to Yvonne. And again, thank you so much to Chris also for waking up so early, and Brook, and to all the attendees.
Yeah.